Hey everybody, Arnaldo here, broadcasting from Fidelity's frequency. Welcome to my channel. About 10 days ago, I published a video announcing a new series by Analogue Productions, focusing on the Rhino catalog, another audiophile series on double 45 RPM. Check out the video to know more details about it. I also showcased two titles that will be the first two titles that will be coming out in this series that I was able to purchase at the event that Chad Kassem hosted in New York City. And one of those titles we'll be talking about today, and that is Van Morrison's Moondance. And I'll talk a little bit about this album, as well as a shootout with the other versions, the other three versions that I have in addition to the acoustic sounds. That is the original that you see behind me, as well as two reissues that came out, both cut by Kevin Gray at different times. And stay tuned and we'll learn more about it. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the new series by Analogue Productions previewed three Van Morrison titles. The first two coming in the series are Astral Weeks and Moondance. And if you want to see more of the titles that are featured on the leaflet that was handed out at the event, you can take a look at my video also on my channel. Moondance by Van Morrison is Van Morrison's third album, released in the UK in January of 1970 and the following month in February in the US. After the critical and commercial failure of the previous album called Astral Weeks, Van Morrison had almost a reality check. He realized that in order to make a career out of making music, he needed a more practical approach to make his albums a bit more accessible. After living in New York City, he relocated to upstate New York in the area of Woodstock, and that is where he wrote the songs that form Moondance. Coming back down, ready to record them in studio at A&R Studios in New York City, Van Morrison enlisted what he thought or considered to be the perfect band, two horns, and a rhythm section. And almost entirely, let's just say, or essentially, producing the album himself, he delivered what is today considered probably his masterpiece. Most of the vocals on Moondance were recorded live by Van Morrison, and his intention was, had it been for him, to record the album entirely live. Needless to say, the results were perfect, and this is my favorite Van Morrison album. It garnered critical acclaim and quite good commercial success, entering the top 40 in the UK and the top 30 in the US. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, this is considered probably Van Morrison's crowning achievement. The usual preface whenever I do a comparison or a shootout video is that these are my ears, my opinion, my taste, my system, which you will see in the description, the components of my system below. So this is always a very subjective take. And now I'd like to get into the comparison or proper shootout portion of this video. And I would like to start off with the two copies that were reissues done in the 2000s by Kevin Gray, done at different times. The first one that I purchased, and that would be this one, even though you can't tell the difference because essentially the covers are identical. And it was a Barnes & Noble exclusive variant on brown and white vinyl. It uses the same plates. This reissue was done in 2016, but it uses the same plates as the 2008 mastering by Steve Hoffman and cut also by Kevin Gray. at Acoustic Mastering. When I first got this pressing, I was really happy with it. Yes, probably the vinyl is not the best. I could hear a little bit of the vinyl noise, like very low floor noise. Probably the original 2008 on black vinyl sounds in terms of noise floor a little bit better than this one, but I was very pleased by the sound. I compared it now that I have an original, and I'm not so pleased by the sound. Or maybe I should say this sounds very different than the original, and I'll tell you why. Van Morrison's voice comes across a bit shrill on this reissue. I have to say that the original probably has a bit more of the midtones on Van Morrison's voice, and his voice appears a little bit more up front when you listen to the original pressing from 1970. And quick note, yes, I do have an original greenie, what people call the green label by Warner from 1970. Overall, this pressing sounds different than the original in the sense that the soundstage is slightly altered. I find it not as dynamic and almost a bit flat compared to the original pressing, but what really comes out the most from this reissue is the top end is quite enhanced to the point that sometimes it may be a little too almost, I don't want to say bright, but the drums, that's where I notice it the most, is on the drums. They're not as solid as on the original, but they have a lot of top end to the snare especially. Overall, I can't say this is a bad pressing. It's just a different sounding pressing compared to the original. Next up is the 2020 reissue, also cut by Kevin Gray. And I'm not entirely or 100% sure, but I've read various sources that this version, the 2020, which is on black vinyl, was cut from a digital source. And between the 2020 version and the 2008 or 2016 version, which I just spoke about, you can tell the difference. Like the 2008 version or 2016 version, this copy also has a top end that is quite enhanced. And one thing that actually is worse compared to the 2008 version is the soundstage. Not only is it flat or flatter than the 2008 pressing, it's narrow. This is one pressing that I cannot recommend. In fact, out of the 4 pressings that I have now at this point accumulated, this is probably the one that I will be getting rid of first. And now the reason why the majority of you have probably tuned into this video for is to find out my thoughts and what I think about the upcoming Analogue Productions version on double 45 of this Moondance. Before I get into talking about the Analogue Productions version, I would like to preface what Chad Kassem said at the event. When he presented this new series, he said that almost all of them will be from analog sources or the best source available. And he was very transparent in disclosing the process that led to the sources for the first 2 reissues, which are Moondance and Astral Weeks. He was provided with the tapes from Rhino, the original tapes, but was not satisfied because they were not in great condition. They were not workable tapes that he felt comfortable cutting from. Next, he was offered the possibility of cutting from another analog source, which was a EQ'd copy. They tried it, and he was not happy with the results. Third and final option was to use a flat digital transfer, and not really sure if that's the same transfer that is the source of the Kevin Gray cut that I spoke about, but the digital transfer is the source of this Analogue Productions version. Matthew Luthans mastered and cut this version of Moondance, as well as all of the other upcoming Rhino audiophile double 45 of the series. Before we get into the sound, I'd like to address something that reluctantly, I have to say, did not meet my expectations. At the event at Innovation Sounds 10 days ago, these copies were for sale. And when I picked up this copy, I noticed immediately that something was off. I don't know if you could tell from the video, but these colors of the album cover are quite off. And typically, Analogue Productions is known for being able to, and being very meticulous about the artwork. They go as far as tip-on heavy cardstock jackets. Sometimes they expand single jackets to double gatefold. In this case, Moondance was already a gatefold, and no issue with the inside of the gatefold, as you could see. But the colors, in my opinion, and I think you'll probably concur with me, is that the color tones are very off. If you take this and you compare it to both of the recent reissues, which are essentially identical when it comes to the cover, you can notice how we've gone from the yellow tint to more of a magenta tint of the album cover. Probably they didn't have the original artwork, but whatever scans they worked with, I think someone went in the art department, went a little heavy on the saturation of the magenta. And not only do you notice the difference with the reissues, but here's the original. Yes, it's probably aged a bit. You can tell that the white is not as stark. It's a little yellow, but overall the tones are very different. You can see the magenta enhanced here, almost orangish, and here it's clearly yellow. I have to say that compared to all of the copies that I have right here, this one probably is a miss when it comes to reproduction of the artwork, at least from my point of view. And now let's get to the sound of this Analogue Productions double 45 version. I did a very thorough comparison, track by track. I listened to this album almost ad nauseum over the last 2 days. I listened to it in headphones, comparing the original as well as the Analogue Productions, in my headphones, and then listening to it in my room. So I think I won't be listening to Moondance for quite a while, but in broad strokes, I have to say that the Analogue Productions has more clarity, has more definition. Van Morrison's voice has a clarity that you do not pick up on in the original. I will say that the original enhances a bit more the midtones of Van Morrison's voice, which to some may be a disappointment. But in my opinion, on my system, I have to say that I can turn this copy, the Analogue Productions copy, up and enjoy it, enjoy the peaks of Van Morrison's voice when he belts it out. On the original, sometimes it can be a little fatiguing when I listen to it at a higher volume because of the fact that the voice is maybe a little bit more upfront and is focused a little bit more on the mid frequencies. Also, I'd have to point out that the soundstage is incredibly improved, not only in terms of wider soundstage, but also in terms of the depth of the soundstage, which makes the presentation of the music a lot more enjoyable, in my opinion. Like I said, I did a song by song, one track at a time comparison, going back and forth multiple times, listening to portions of the songs. I was very thorough, very detailed in the comparison. And here are some of the things that on certain tracks came to my attention. On the title track on Moondance, the rim has a snap that I hear on the Analogue Productions versions, which does not come through as present on the OG. Crazy Love, that's the track when Van Morrison is not a belter on that track. He has a very soft, delicate, high register type of performance. And it's a little bit buried on the OG, on the original. And on the Analogue Productions, it is, I don't want to say front and center, but it has a dimension to it where almost, it sounds like Van Morrison is singing in your ear because it is a very soft and delicate delivery, vocal delivery. On the song Caravan, there is a piano part. It's very tingling and very detailed, very focused on the Analogue Productions, very defined on the Analogue Productions version, more so than on the original. The snare has more snap on this track than it does on the original, where it is just a little bit more muffled. And now something I noticed on both closing tracks of each side, as expected, on a double 45 there is more groove space, so the inner tracks will almost always sound a little bit better on a double 45, and the Analogue Productions doesn't disappoint. On the track Into the Mystic, which is probably one of my favorite tracks on Moondance, the acoustic guitars, they glisten. The cymbals are very present. They have almost a dimension of their own. I'm not going to say that they're boosted, they're just better sounding. And then at some point, halfway through the track, there's a tambourine. When you hear that rattle of the tambourine and then it plays throughout the rest of the track, it's definitely more noticeable, more defined on the Analogue Productions than it is on the original. Continuing on to side 2, the opening track, Come Running, Van Morrison's voice sounds a little bit thin on the OG, in my opinion. Here it comes through with a little bit more body. On Everyone, there is a harpsichord, I believe that's what the instrument is called, at the very beginning of the track, and it sounds different. I can't say that it sounds better on the Analogue Productions than the original pressing. It just sounds a little bit different. Maybe the position in the soundstage, it just comes off different. I can't really put my ear on it. There's one more thing that I'd like to point out, and overall it is expected. Being this a double 45, you'd expect that the bottom end have a lot more presence, and that is definitely the case. I don't think it's too much. It's definitely a little bit more present than on the original, but I am perfectly happy with how the bass is reproduced on the original. So I guess it depends on your taste, right? It's not excessive, it's not booming, and it's not muddy, but you can definitely hear that there is a bit more bottom end on the Analogue Productions. So what are my final thoughts on all 4 of these copies? Well, I already told you that I'm not really happy with the what I think is currently in print, the reissue that is currently in print, cut by Kevin Gray. I had the 2020 version from a digital source. Probably that will be the one that I will be gifting or selling off, which leaves us with 233 versions, the original that you see behind me, and the other one cut by Kevin Gray and Steve Hoffman in 2008. I already said that the 2008 is not a bad sounding version of Moondance. It's a different sounding version from the original, but if I have to pick between a 33, I would definitely stick with the original. Has a different character, has a different tone, which brings me to the final thoughts on this Analogue Productions double 45 from a digital source. Chad Kassem typically does not cut from digital sources. That's the whole point of his label called Analogue Productions. Another album that I know that I have from Analogue Productions that was cut from a digital source because there is no other source is Steely Dan's Two Against Nature, I think it was. And I really enjoy that album. I think he did a fine job with it. And what are my thoughts on the results of the Analogue Productions double 45? Well, I'll be keeping this one too. I really enjoy the listening experience that I get from it. Different for some aspects from the original. Definitely some aspects, many aspects have been improved upon from the original, most notably, and for sure, the soundstage. In my opinion, I prefer the presentation on the Analogue Productions. Some may like it and some may not. Some may enjoy how Van Morrison sounds on the original, but I guess everyone will make up their own mind once this album is released. The series has not yet been announced officially, and I believe it will be in the first week of December, with the first two releases, Van Morrison's Moondance and Astral Weeks, that will be coming, I believe, in January. So that is all for today's video. Please let me know your thoughts. Leave a comment what you think about Van Morrison's Moondance, what you think about the versions that you may already have, namely the original or the other two that I talked about. I'd like to hear your opinion on those as well. Please remember to hit that like button if you liked the video, or the thumbs down if you didn't. Of course, I always remind you to subscribe to the channel. It definitely allows the channel to gain more visibility and grow in the future. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.